In this brief introduction to the Psalms, we'll take a look at three different areas. First, the origin of the Psalms and the place that they hold in the Jewish and in the Christian scriptures. Second, we'll get an overview of the characteristics of Hebrew poetry that assist us in interpreting them. And finally, I'll give you my 6-step methodology for applying and interpreting the Psalms. If you've ever begun to read through the book of Psalms, you realize at some point that there's actually a collection of 5 books of Psalms. And you may wonder why 5. And the answer is probably that it has something to do with other collections of books of the Old Testament. For example, we have 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch. We have 5 books of poetry. We have 5 major prophets. The number 5 has significance in Hebrew poetry and thought, and so it's very likely that the Psalms were divided into 5 books for that reason. The book of Psalms was composed over a 1,000-year period of time, from the time of Moses to the time following the exile. It's likely that there were various arrangements of the Psalms, compilations of the Psalms, and those were finally edited and placed as we receive them today, sometime in the 5th century BC. David is the author of 73 of the Psalms, so others that composed Psalms were the sons of Korah, as well as Asaph, which may have been an individual, it may have been a family name. Solomon wrote 2 songs, and then Moses, Ethan, and then the rest are untitled or unnamed. Another experience that you often have in reading the Psalms is of being on an emotional roller coaster. You go from Psalms that are intensely exciting and celebratory to others that are very dark and depressing and express frustration with God. And this is a reflection of the fact that there are many different genres of Psalms. Some Psalms are very personal. Psalm 63 says, "O God, you are my God, and earnestly I seek you in a dry and weary land where there's no water." Psalm 95 begins in a celebratory mood by saying, "Come, let us sing for joy, let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation." Likewise, Psalm 47 begins by saying, "Clap your hands, all ye nations, shout to God with cries of joy." While Psalm 22 speaks of a different type of crying. The psalmist says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" There's a lot of wisdom in the Psalms. Psalm 90 says, "Teach us to number the days of our lives aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." There's also Psalms of judgment. Psalm 50 says, "The mighty one, God, the Lord, comes and will not be silent. He comes to judge his people." And we'll understand that with these multiple genres, there are different reasons and approaches that we take because of the genre of those Psalms. The place of the Psalms in Jewish and Christian scripture. Well, first, in the Jewish scriptures, we note that the Psalms are the first book in the 3rd division of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 parts: the Torah, that is the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Then the Nevi'im, that's the prophets, and those are divided into 2 groups, actually, the former and the latter prophets. The 3rd division is the Ketuvim, or the writings. The Psalms are the first book in the writings, and so sometimes you'll, in the New Testament, speak of the Jewish scriptures as the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Now, if you take the first letter of each of those words, you get the acronym Tanakh. And this is the term that Jewish people use to refer to their scriptures, the Tanakh, what the Christians would call the Old Testament. The Hebrew name for the book of Psalms is Sefer, that's book, Tehillim, praises, book of praises. It's also referred to as the songbook of the Second Temple. Second Temple being that temple that was built following the return from exile. Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. It was rebuilt when the exiles returned. It was expanded upon during the time of Herod in the 1st century. And it's very likely that the Psalms were compiled during this period of revival and renewal of worship as the exiles returning from Babylon rebuilt the temple and reinstated worship. From the Christian's perspective, the place of the Psalms follows the Septuagint order of the Old Testament. Now, the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was completed in the 3rd century BC. The Jewish people had been scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world, and the common language of the people was Greek. So it made sense to translate the Hebrew into Greek so more people would have access to the scriptures. That was accomplished traditionally by 70 scholars. Hence, the abbreviation for the Septuagint is the Roman numeral for 70. And the Septuagint has a different order of books of Old Testament than the Tanakh. And in the case of the Septuagint, the Psalms fall roughly in the center of the Old Testament. And this is the book order that Christians are familiar with in our copies of the Old Testament. The Psalms are the most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. And that could be simply because it's the longest Old Testament book. It could also be that it was most familiar to them because it had been set to music. And we all know that it's easy to remember things if we set them to music. For understanding Hebrew poetry, you need to understand some of the dominant characteristics of it. The dominant characteristic of Hebrew poetry is definitely parallelism. And parallelism simply means a correspondence. The most common expression of this is that the second line corresponds in some way to the first. Now, usually that is in a similar way, as in, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. The two lines say similar things. In contrast to that, we also have antithetic parallelism, where the second line says something opposite. Psalm 1:6, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And then we have a hybrid, in a sense, a synthetic, which is where the second line adds to the first. So it's not quite synonymous, but the second line adds something additional to the first, as in Psalm 14:2, the Lord looks down on the children of men to see if there are any that understand and seek him. There are other types of parallelism, and we'll consider those as we get further into the study. Figurative language, of course, is a feature of all poetry. The use of metaphor and simile. For example, the Lord is my rock. So it's a direct comparison of two essentially unlike things. And we don't mean that God is exactly like a rock, but that he shares characteristics of a rock, unchanging, firm, secure, etc. A simile is a direct comparison using like or as. For example, Psalm 42:1, as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you. Or he is like a tree planted by the streams of water. Another common feature of Hebrew poetry is the use of anthropomorphism and personification. Now, anthropomorphism is when you take something that is divine and give that human characteristics. So when we ascribe human characteristics to the divine, this is anthropomorphism. For example, when the psalmist says, how long will you hide your face from me? That's an example of anthropomorphism, God with a face. We often see in the Psalms a reference to God's ears, his eyes, his hands. This is anthropomorphism. On the other side of that, we have personification, and this is where we portray inanimate objects or non-human things with human terms. So this would be like the trees of the forest will clap their hands. So anthropomorphism is the divine portrayed as human. Personification is the inanimate portrayed as human. A third feature of Hebrew poetry, a third type of figurative language, is hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggeration for the sake of emphasis, overstating things, not meant to be taken literally, but exaggeration. When the psalmist speaks of being surrounded by tens of thousands of enemies, that's probably not literally true, and we understand that because that's figurative language. A third feature of Hebrew poetry is the use of chiasm. I'll have a lot more to say about this later on, but essentially chiasm is a way of saying you have, in this case, two ideas, an idea that we'll call A, an idea that we'll call B. And so we state those two ideas in that order, A, B, and then we state something similar, but reversing the order, B, A. And Psalm 2 is an example of this, where the A part is speaking about the kings of the earth, and the B part is speaking about God, the King of heaven. Likewise, in Psalm 8, we have a chiasm. You have an A part, a B part, and a C part. And in this case, the force of the chiasm is to draw attention to the C part, a part that is unique and at the center of the psalm. Often we think in Western thought, we think in a linear fashion, that we prove a case, we develop evidence and prove a point. In a chiasm, in Hebrew poetry, what you have is the point is in the middle of the argument rather than at the end. Chiasms occur in individual verses, they occur in entire psalms, or even in groups of psalms, as we'll see as we look at the arrangement of the psalms in their final collection. Over the years, I've developed an approach for meditating on the psalms. And it begins with a look at the author's intended meaning. First thing I want to do is to look at the psalms through the lens of the author. What was going on in his world at that time, both his personal world as well as the larger culture. This is critical. This is foundational to all understanding of Scripture, is to identify the author's intended meaning, the aim, the AIM. And so we look there first, and we spend some time there. We analyze the poetry, the language, and we make sure we understand what did the author mean when he wrote this. The second thing we look for, and maybe this is a second reading through the psalm, we're looking for theology. We're looking for what the psalmist tells us about God. What does this psalm reveal about the nature of God? Sometimes it's very direct, sometimes it's implicit, but we're looking for how the psalms reveal God to us. The third lens is that of the editor, because these psalms were compiled, collected, following the exile, to be used in temple worship, and there's a reason that they are ordered and arranged in the way that they are. Why are they in 5 books? Why are they collected as they are? If you read straight through the Psalms, it may seem pretty confusing, but as you'll see, there is exquisite design to the ordering and arrangement of the Psalms to tell a larger story. The fourth lens that we look through is the lens of Jesus. Now, we know that Jesus prayed the Psalms. He was Jewish. He would have been very familiar with them. He prayed them on many occasions. We know specifically a few of the Psalms that he prayed on specific occasions. But Jesus also is the fulfillment of the Psalms. Jesus said to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, he opened their eyes that they would see all the things that were written about him in the law and the prophets and the Psalms. And so Jesus, as the fulfillment of the Psalms, we look for him in the Psalms. We see things that point ultimately to Jesus. The fifth lens is what I call the New Testament lens, or the church lens, and it's how we read the New Testament as it interprets the Psalms, as it applies the Psalms. Because the writers of the New Testament were Jewish, and they were familiar with the Psalms, and they applied these Psalms to Jesus and to the church. And so we'll see how the Psalms also point us to the church. And then finally, we will make personal application. What does this psalm have to do with me, with our current modern culture? What lessons can be learned? How can we be transformed by it?